If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Almitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
Welcome back, Equity Warriors. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. I have a guest with me today. Her name is Christina Rodriguez, and she's a leader with over 20 years in educational publishing. Christina began her career in the classroom and now develops research-backed resources that improve literacy and support neurodiverse learners. As a passionate advocate for educational equity, she ensures all students receive the support they need to succeed. Christina holds degrees in interdisciplinary studies as well as reading and literacy. Christina, I am so excited to welcome you to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Well, you and I always have wonderful conversations. So I have to ask first, because I know, but I want everyone to hear this story about what inspired you to found Tumbleweed Publishing, and then how does Tumbleweed's mission support neurodiverse learners?
Sure. So I've had this dream for quite some time as the mother of a neurodiverse learner. My son, my youngest, is a thriving high school student now, but in elementary school, it was a struggle for him with ADD, struggle to learn, to pay attention, to focus. And so he was fortunate enough to have myself and a very supportive father as well to make sure those scaffolds were in place, and fierce educators seeing his talent, seeing his intellect, and making sure those accommodations were made. Also, my dear friend who is on my team, her daughter is profoundly dyslexic. And 8 to 10 years ago, when her daughter was diagnosed, there were no materials out there for Rebecca. And all Rebecca wanted to do was read a book just like every other child. And so Cheryl and I began, making books for her, separating the text from the pictures, making sure that it was age-appropriate content she was reading, but at her decodability level. So it's something I've been watching for quite some time. Our NAEP scores, as you know, Almitra, are just deplorable. And when we break down that, aggregate that data even further, our marginalized children are even at a greater deficit. So I was, just for making sure the timing was right in the market and making sure that the ears were open, right? Our ears were open to listening to what was going on in these marginalized communities. And I just decided that now was the time.
That is awesome. I think I've shared this with you as well. My son, who's no longer a child, he's 33? I don't know. They're getting old. Not me, just the kids, is also ADD. And I remember those struggles especially in elementary school, in finding texts that he was interested in, that he could attend to, just the classroom environment. So, getting that 504 plan in place. Mm-hmm. And I was fortunate enough to have educators, for the most part, who understood what a 504 was and the accommodations that needed to be made. But it was a struggle all the way through to keep him engaged in something. He could attend to whatever he was really interested in, but It wasn't all right. And I think that's one of the misunderstandings about some of our neurodiverse learners, that ADD children, it's not that they cannot attend, it's that they attend to everything or the one thing that truly engages them. Mm-hmm. And so I think finding those pieces of literature and those stories that they truly engage in is a huge piece of getting them connected to schools.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes for neurotypical kids as well, right? We know what works for your son and my son also works for neurotypical kids. That if you're not hooking them the minute they turn the page in a book or they're listening to something in a read aloud, then we've already lost them. And so making sure that text is accessible and engaging, and it's a lot of hard work to do that in a decodable reader, but it can be done.
Yeah. So decodable readers, some people might not understand what those are. I'm not going to assume that everyone listening is an educator. So let's talk about decodables. And you've done something special with yours.
Yes. So decodable readers, when we think about that, we're thinking about on a phonics scope and sequence. So they need to be aligned to a very explicit and systematic phonics scope and sequence. And we think about what sound spelling relationships have the children learned, plus those high frequency words. We also want to make sure that we have a really engaging and meaningful text, because we read for meaning. So generally, having about maybe 5 to 10% of those words in the text that are not controlled. They haven't learned those sound spelling relationships yet, but we're giving them the tools in pre-teaching and giving them that opportunity to kind of stretch their reading and stretch their literacy skills to be able to understand that and to be able to comprehend that. So decodable texts are really, really important in cementing those foundational skills, cracking that code, giving them text that they have those sound spelling relationship patterns, plus those high frequency words, but also making sure it's natural language. So just the way we would speak, that syntax is so important, and meaning. So at the end of that book, we can have some really engaging, high-level critical thinking skills as well as literal comprehension skills attached to it.
Yeah, really important. And you said, and it's like, I feel like I've said this so many times, explicit systematic instruction, which is so important and so key, not just for neurodiverse learners, but neurotypical learners.
Correct.
I think it's something like the 3% of children that are really and truly gifted. I remember this from one of my professors years ago, said you could put a mushroom in front of those kids and they'll learn how to read. Yes. It's just like they'll break the code by themselves. There are those natural code breakers, but they're so rare, so few. And the vast majority of our kids do need something that's explicit and systematic, that they can be certain that what they're reading is truly, or that they can read what we're putting in front of them, because we've made sure that they have all those prerequisite skills and keeping that text truly decodable early on. But there are some sort of leads me to this idea that neurodiverse learners, or there are some misconceptions about our neurodiverse learners and literacy instruction. So are there any that come to you top of your head? What are some of the things that you hear people say about or believe about our neurodiverse learners that are truly misconceptions?
That they will never learn to read.
Yeah.
They can't read. They should just listen to audio books. Reading is out of their league for them. They're dumb. Right. That they're just, categorizing them as special needs. When we think about the statistics of entrepreneurs, they've done a lot of research on that. 40% of entrepreneurs are likely to be neurodiverse. So what does that tell us, right? If you're an entrepreneur, you can successfully have creativity, you can run a business, you've obviously learned to read. So that misconception of that you cannot learn to read because you're neurodiverse, or that you're just dumb, is really frightening and maddening.
Hey there, Equity Warriors. I want to take a quick moment to share something exciting with you. You know how passionate I am about equity in education, right? Well, I've created a special space, a safe space, where we can dive even deeper into these crucial topics. It's our Patreon channel, and I'd love for you to join me there. Here's why it's so awesome. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll get access to exclusive content that I will not share anywhere else. I'm talking additional insights, workshops like you would get in regular professional learning sessions, resources that can really amplify your impact in education. But it's more than just extra content. By subscribing, you are directly supporting our mission. You're helping to create more valuable discussions and resources that you've come to love. You're part of the change we're making in educational systems. And let me tell you, our Patreon community, it is something special. It's a place where passionate educators and advocates can come together, share ideas, and drive real change. So if you're ready to take your commitment to educational equity to the next level, I'd be thrilled to have you join me. Just head over to patreon.com/3E podcast. That's patreon.com/3E podcast. Remember, your support means the world to me, and it helps me continue this important work. Together, we can create the educational system all our students deserve. Thanks for considering, and now let's get back to the episode. Yeah. And I think even more so that sometimes comes out of the mouths of people who consider themselves to be educators. And I'm phrasing it that way. I'll say, in my book, I differentiate between teachers and educators. That educators are truly there to educate and lead children on a path forward, where teachers are just putting information out there and they don't really understand about learning, but they've got a job and a paycheck, et cetera, et cetera. I'll use my less colorful language. It really makes me angry when I hear things like that. Frankly, it ticks me off that I still hear these things said. And I heard them said about my son, which really, then that was at a point where I no longer had teachers he did not have teachers assigned who were educators. They were teachers. They didn't understand. They didn't get it. And it was the year that I heard in a 504 meeting, a new teacher who happened to have been recruited from Montana, because it was easy for the district to get people from Montana to move to California because the pay was so much better. And she said, well, those boys. Yeah. Major eye roll here. Those boys. And I had to stop her mid-sentence and say, which boys are you talking about? Yeah. So it was this combination between those she assumed were neurodiverse, and she didn't even have that word in her lexicon, but also kids of color.
Correct.
The boys of color. And that is a whole, if we go back to, what you said about NAEP scores and we disaggregate that data, unfortunately, our Black kids are scoring even lower than our neurodiverse children. And what does that tell us about education? And I know in Tumbleweed that you have, the books that I've seen and we've talked about, you have gone to great lengths, which, makes me smile. I'm so excited about that, to make sure that every child can see themselves, truly see themselves in your text.
And that is so intentional. Years ago, but when I left the classroom in the district level and I shifted into educational publishing, that's how I started. I had a big complaint that there were no books for our brown and Black boys or girls that didn't want to play with dolls. It was all unicorns, cupcakes, and butterflies. And if we cannot bring in what a child's what their neighborhood is like, what their community is like, what their culture is like for boys and girls alike, then we're really missing out. We're missing out on capturing them at a young age to see themselves, like you said, what our neurodiverse kids can do. They can focus, right?
Oh, yeah.
They can, but it has to be on something they want to focus on. Same thing with you and I, who are neurotypical. If I open a book and it's not engaging and I can't see myself in it or I can't relate to it, I'm closing it. Right?
It's nap time for me.
It is, it's let me go turn on Netflix, right? Let me go see what else I can do. And so thinking about that, our marginalized kids, it's even more and more important because they're coming to school with so many other deficits, maybe potentially language deficits, family deficits. They may not have a family unit intact. Yeah. They may not have parents who even understand what neurodiversity is, right? They don't know how to fight for their children. They don't know how to advocate. That goes to a whole nother conversation we could have. That's about breaking the barriers, right? Yeah. Making sure all feel welcome, not just that we're creating content for all learners and then we're thinking about the whole child, but we have to start thinking about those family units and those communities as well. Or we're never going to break the literacy crisis. It's just going to get worse and worse. Yeah.
It scares me, and I don't want to go too much into the political climate, but I read an article this past week that Houston ISD, which is one of the largest districts in the country, was ending all of their wraparound services. And just the idea that in a city of that size, what is it, roughly 200,000 students in the district, something like that, my number may be off, that they would, I shouldn't say for whatever reason, because I have an idea what the reason is, that they would no longer want to provide those services given the political climate that we're in, but that we are really, by some of the steps that are being taken, fueling a greater crisis of literacy and reading right now. So anyhow, I'll vent about that on another episode.
Right. But to eliminate those, then, I mean, if we look at those statistics, our leaders, take the politics out of it. Our leaders need to look at that dyslexic to prison pipeline, that 48% of our prison inmates have dyslexia and over 80% are functionally illiterate. So that is we as a society, if as an American person, like I said, take politics out of it, whether you're an educator or not, we as Americans should say enough is enough. Everyone has a right to read. And if we think about within those statistics, those 48% of, prison inmates, they likely entered prison by doing something, going back to those entrepreneurial statistics you and I talked about, they were probably entrepreneurs themselves. Just not the entrepreneurs we want and need. So if we can fuel that through literacy, and giving them the tools, are they all going to go on and have highly educated careers? Maybe not. And that's
maybe not. But they still have those skills innate in them. They have those skills to think critically, to figure out how to build a business, whatever that business is, not the one that landed them in prison. But they have a skill set that if we properly educate them as children, they can lean into, and whether they, become carpenters or plumbers, or, we still need tradespeople.
We do.
Whatever those skill sets are that help them to build a business that they're interested in that is legal. We should be educating them so that they can do that, as opposed to having to educate more people to be prison guards. I mean, it just sort of boggles the mind.
And it's like, you think about that, and if we think about the prison reform too, some of those inmates are never going to be incarcerated, right? They're going to stay in prison the rest of their life, but they still have the right to literacy. Maybe they can provide some good on the inside and mentor another inmate that does have the opportunity to go back into society, get them those tools, and we think about our children because that's where our focus is. I always say, and I've said this for years, that children either win or lose the lottery when they're born. They have no say of who they come onto this earth to, who is their mother, who is potentially, their father, their family. And we have a duty as a country to allow every child that equal opportunity and that access to quality education. And so thinking of going back to those NAEP scores, and especially in our marginalized communities, those young Black boys. So what's happening in those schools? Are they not getting highly trained educators? Do they not have the same materials placed in front of them? Are they not being identified? 1 in 5 children are neurodiverse. I mean, that is just data that we can't argue with. And so thinking about that, of how can we unpack that and make sure that accessibility and that equal opportunity for every child, despite what their zip code is, has that opportunity for literacy. And it has to be early on. If we, in 3rd grade, when these young children are being diagnosed with dyslexia, if we do not have that intervention right then, it's going to be 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and they're still going to be reading at kindergarten or 1st grade level. And then they make choices to belong.
Right. And we know that, early intervention is always best. We know that we can diagnose dyslexia very early on, and that we can counter it if we catch it early enough. And that goes right back to that explicit systematic phonics. Years ago, sometimes I feel really old, and I think it had to be, now we're talking about 15 years ago, that I did sort of the alignment for Texas's, they actually did something good, their dyslexia initiative. And they wanted to make sure that they were doing early identification of dyslexia statewide, and looking at how that should work and materials that align to that. And so there were wonderful things happening in identifying at kindergarten and 1st grade, right? And then watching those numbers fall of the children identified with dyslexia at 3rd grade, or still having something that they were identifying as dyslexia at 3rd grade, just tells us, if we do it right early, that we will have a much smaller problem later on. And so I always I want to stay on content, but my personal is I question whether or not we really want to do it right as a society that you just alluded to. If we really care, and we should care, we will do these things correctly. Let's talk about culturally responsive literacy, which has almost become something that we're not supposed to talk about anymore. You talked about having the importance of children seeing themselves, and you've made sure that in Tumbleweed books that every child can see themselves. For me, that's my third equity pillar in instruction, and that's representation, that every child, or impartiality, that every child can see themselves in the materials in front of them. And it doesn't matter whether it's literature or math or science, that every child can still see themselves represented in that instructional material. More so for neurodiverse learners, right?
Absolutely. Because it goes back to that focus, right? It can focus to what they choose to, right? To make sure that what they're reading is reflective of their culture. And all kids can learn from that, right? So thinking about in small group instruction, if you have that, a mixed group, which you are, of different ethnicities, the white and the brown can learn about culturally relevant things that are important to the Black culture, like some of the literature that we have. And I had a teacher in New York City call my decodable book. She said, this is really beautiful, authentic literature. For someone to say that decodable readers are authentic literature, I know I've done something really well. But we chose to focus on Langston Hughes. I mean, what an impact he had to society as a whole. But generationally, you think about the time, how impactful it was for the Black community at that time, and what that legacy and his words and his power and this beautiful poet. So for young Black boys and girls to be able to see that reflected in books, wow, someone cared about my culture. Someone cared enough to create this book. But then for those other children in the group, right, that they can learn, that they can be impacted by it. Thinking about from a Hispanic perspective to bring in, the Hispanic cultures. That's great for white children, for, Middle Eastern descent, for Black children to learn about what is the importance of that, of that culture. Same thing. I mean, when you think about just America in general, I mean, we weren't ever just white, right? No. It was never built that way. And so making sure that everyone, thinking about one of the books we have, it's about a little girl, Sam, and she's with her nan, and she has to come up with an idea for a company, right? She wants to build a company, and she lives with her nan, who is of Middle Eastern descent. So she has her hijab. Can you imagine how that would feel for a third, fourth grader to be able to see that reflected? Oh, wow. And it's, she's working with her nan. The end of the story, they come up and they're going to come up with the Sam and Nan fig jam company. So, they like to make jam together, but it's just so critical for that. And it's been so long overlooked. And thinking about Almitra, what I talked with you the last time, and you connecting me to your dear friend, Candace, I can't wait to interview her because we already have it planned out for a loctician. Can you imagine the eyes on a young Black girl to be, wow, and not only that, but for what I just said, for every other child in that group to learn the history behind it, the time it takes, the art behind that, and what it means to, a young, one of their friends in their class. And so if we can build that cultural relevance, I feel like we're breaking down some of those barriers that have been there for years. And that comes back to just lack of understanding. You and I have talked a lot about, African-American vernacular English. Had a conversation this weekend with my oldest daughter's friend who's working on his PhD, and he's the only man of color in this, first man of color in this program, and was talking to him just about that. But that awareness, right? I think it's just, if we can do that when kids are young, we do want to see color, right? They always say, oh, we don't see color. You should see color. You should. But then you understand the importance of what that color means to that person and to their family and their community.
Yeah. So much there. Yes. So this month is Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Last month was Arab American, Middle Eastern, North African Heritage Month. And I think about, and I've said in episodes from last month for MENA and this month for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, the importance of seeing yourself, one. But two, also for educators to understand, so I sort of vented, I think it was last week's episode, that we lump all of these groups together. It annoys me. My personal annoyance is Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. That's a lot of different ethnicities, right? And so if we stereotypically put all Asian Americans into a bucket and we say, well, we have this book on Asian American, well, which group?
Correct.
Of Asians? We do the same thing with Latino. And, sort of my personal pet, I have a lot of personal pet peeves, is that we'll say Latino or Hispanic. And I say, so are we erasing Brazilians? Right. Because they're not Hispanic. They are Latino, but they are from South America, or the Latinos from the Caribbean, right? So I think one of the things that you provide by having these mirrors and windows and stories that are almost ethnicity specific, if I can use that as a term, is that people will see that there is differentiation between groups that may share some physical characteristics, but that their culture and the heritage are different when we dig into it. And just to make that connection for a child, as soon as you talked about a little girl or seeing the hijab in a story. It takes me back to this one student that I had who did wear a hijab, and she was the only one in the school. It was her and her siblings. And I had nothing that reflected her culture in my classroom, but spent a lot of time with her, making her feel valued and welcomed, and finally getting the English to come out, because she didn't speak as a sixth grader, no English at all when she came in, and was not literate because she'd never been in school, because in her country, girls were not educated. So I think of how powerful it would have been for her to see a story like that. Even as a decodable, she wouldn't have cared, because the girl was like a sponge. Anything I put in front of her, she just wanted to look at the pictures and learn to read. But that is so important for children. And I think so many of us, if we've not had the exposure and the connection and the time, we just don't get it. No. We don't get it.
And I think it's important what you said, especially like about the, Asian Americans and then Latinos, obviously Rodriguez, I am Latino by marriage, my husband, his whole family is from Mexico, but the culture, like you said, in the Caribbean, Latinos is much different. Puerto Rico is much different. Even in Cuba, even the Spanish is different. The food is different. And so making sure that, just because you're Latino doesn't mean that you're Mexican, doesn't mean that you're Puerto Rican. There's so many variances. And then thinking about your student, like how wonderful that made her feel, but for them to allow children to share, right? Yeah. Explain the meaning behind the hijab, right? Yeah. What does that mean? And what food, if you're talking about a Latino and the difference in food and between Puerto Rico and Cuba and Mexico and the Caribbean, of why it's important, and just bringing that culturally infused knowledge, and it's knowledge building, right? That transfer of knowledge, because knowledge is powerful. When we have knowledge, then we can overcome the ignorance, right? And that is I do use that word because most people are culturally ignorant about those stereotypes, and just taking the time. It just takes a little bit of time, like you did as an educator, because you were an educator, not just a teacher, of learning about that culture and why it's important to that student, and what can you do in the classroom to make that, what can you do for their families. Again, going back to that, because that family unit is so important. That is a big missing piece in a lot of children that don't have that. So now let's look at the community. What can we do with the community to bring in that cultural importance is welcome here. It's not just welcome, but it's appreciated. It's acknowledged. And then I can tell you, I know we would see a big difference if as a society we could make sure that was the educational focus.
Christina, you sound like an ad for my book, The Culturally Competent Educator. So I'm going to make sure I get you a copy of that. I've got some free copies I can get you, like today, an ebook copy. And I'm going to make sure you have it because you literally just pulled about 2 chapters out of the book and consolidated them into your answer. But it is important for us as educators as well. Part of the reason I wrote that, the culturally competent educator, is because unless you have some level of cultural competency, all of these other things that we're talking about, whether it's creating that environment in your classroom that is safe and welcoming, properly implementing literacy using books that have representation, and how you use that and talk about that, seeing every child and their color, which is not something we should be ignoring, why that is so important. Even taking it down to, because if you don't have that some level of competency, hopefully a higher one, you can't be comfortable teaching those children. And if you are really comfortable and you're not culturally competent, my fear is that you have such a level of racism in you that you feel like you're giving this gift of your supremacy to these children of color.
It shakes you to the core, right? When you think about that there could be a classroom that has a teacher, because I would never qualify that as an educator.
No.
That, but it would go back to ignorance, right? It would just go back to, we need to be preparing teachers to be educators, to be able to be very, very have that discerning eye in educational materials that are put in front of them. What can I look? I can put 2 decodables next to each other. Do they know how to determine which one is higher quality? Not sure, right? What are they looking for? Is it pretty? Okay, yes, all of Tumbleweed's books are beautiful, whether it's the photos or the art, but looking at those words. So I think we've got a lot of work to do with educators as well to make sure that they understand, what does it mean to be culturally competent? What does it mean to have culturally relevant teaching? And regardless, again, we'll go back to that, the politics that you talked about earlier, nothing can happen in our political system that can remove being culturally competent. They can take every word out of it, but that is just a critical piece of education to make sure that our future generations are empowered with this, that they feel that they have been seen, that they've been heard, and give them the tools that they need to be successful.
Yeah. So that's PD, right? Ongoing professional development or professional learning is critical. So how would you say that ongoing PD can help teachers, or what type of PD would help teachers better support both neurodiverse learners or all marginalized learners in a gen ed setting specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So you would need to have that on-demand PD, that asynchronous on-demand, but that in person, right? I've seen a lot of school districts move away from that because of budget cuts, right? So making sure that you have that ability, that those educators really to understand the what, the why, and the how. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? And how am I doing it? But not just that one and done. A lot of programs will start with that. It has to be ongoing. So teachers need to be able to feel like they can go to that publisher and have that relationship of, hey, I have this small group, or in my gen ed setting, I've got this small group. I've got this child, doing this. These are the reading delays I'm seeing, or the writing, because that reading, that decoding and encoding are so reciprocal. Yeah. But having that, because of having then that knowledge, okay, well, now you could do this, or now you could do that. Having coaches in the buildings, right, who are in the buildings, not just sitting in a district office, right, that are in the buildings every day, rotating through, working with teachers, hands-on, especially when we think about our new teachers and then maybe our veteran teachers. So our veteran teachers didn't have science of reading training. Our new teachers are coming in who just have a bachelor's degree. They're not prepared to teach children how to read or write. You need to go on a master's in reading and literacy to be able to understand that. So building, publishers need to make sure that they're building professional development with all those use cases for teachers as well as students, in mind. And what works for neurodiverse kids works wonderful. Works
for all kids.
Same thing as multilingual learners, right?
Yes.
if you look at multilingual learner instruction and you read it, really great, high quality, you're like, well, everyone's a language learner. So this is great. We can just transfer that. That is really important. And also taking those stereotypes away, what we were talking about, about neurodiverse kids. The large majority of those children, their vocabulary is at or way above grade level. It is not their auditory or their brain functioning. It is just the decoding piece, and the encoding piece is so hard. So that's why, those read alouds are so important. Robust read alouds, taking that connected text of that decodable text, and then pairing it or combining it with really robust read alouds to ensure that language and that vocabulary development, they're hearing it, they can demonstrate comprehension with that. But again, that goes back to what you were talking about with teachers. A lot of teachers aren't aware of that. They think, well, they can't decode this. They can't decode, this book. So why would they be able to read, listen to anything at a higher level?
They can't read it. So why would they understand what's in it? Drives me nuts. Yes. One of the things, again, so much in what you just said, you made me think too. One of the things in terms of my work that I am so proud of and that was so fulfilling was as a consultant pushing into classrooms, right? Being able to go back to a school time after time after time and see the development not only of a teacher or educator going from being a technician, so to speak, to being more of an engineer and understanding instruction, but also seeing the development of children who, and one of my favorite things, they would call me the reading lady, is when I'd come back, I know I was the reading lady, but to come back after 2 or 3 months when things had changed, and they would tell me they were so proud because I can do this now. I can read this now. And they always wanted me to hear them read. Is so important, and so many districts moved away from it. So yes, asynchronous, online, whatever, that's great. I actually do that with my book on book study because, I can't push into schools. That schools just aren't there right now. And that's great for teachers who can do on their own because their districts are not providing instruction or PD for them. But I hope that more schools and districts will go back to bringing consultants in if they don't have full-time coaches that live in their district and push into classrooms, but bringing those back, and that publishers will still hold on to those models. In what I saw, when I saw it dying, it was because it was not profitable, in terms of dollars and cents, not that it wasn't profitable, that children were learning to read, but just, that part right there. So to speak.
Well, and that's so important, and I've said this for a long time. You could have, the very best pedagogical educational solution in front of a teacher. But if they do not know how to use it or how to adapt it, right? Because
right, for their kids
does not fit all, then you're not going to get that data. And that's the reason why we want to build great curriculum. And for me, with Tumbleweed, of having that hand-in-hand approach with districts, is I want to see the data. I want to see the growth. And can I take that back to what I'm going to be developing next? Can I make it better, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, this really worked, but how can we make it better? And also, too, listening to kids. Right? Yes, we have some great books in Tumbleweed, but I might be in a PD and a teacher might say, oh, well, my kids want to read about this. Well, guess what? We can, we'll get that.
We can develop that. Yeah.
We can develop it, but it's just continually making things better. And especially for educators, that support, right? And for the kids, the confidence, when you were talking about, there's the reading lady. Get excited about that, right? Yeah. If we can infuse that confidence. There's a dyslexic therapist that is working with us right now, and she's been, doing some user feedback and test feedback for me. And she said last week that one of the little boys that she's been tutoring for 2 years now felt like that was the first time he had read a real book when he had a Tumbleweed book in front of him. And he was so excited he wanted to take it back to back into his school. Like, let me go show off to my classmates. Let me go show my teacher what I can do. And that for me is like, that's the joy in, watching when kids finally, when they finally crack the code, even if it's just a little, right? This book, Cat Bath, which you've seen, Almitra, it's early first grade, right? But this is a fourth grader who for 2 years has struggled cracking that code. And so now we have this confidence. Once we can get them confident, just the wheels just, spin and spin. Yeah.
I love that moment. And we don't have enough of them, or I have not had, I don't think I could ever have enough of them. But as I think back to the kids that I was listening to when they finally cracked the code, the kids I was listening to when they first did a Dibbles read aloud and had no errors, those types of things that really, I would say that sort of gives me that fix. Call me a reading junkie. I don't know. But when, that moment, and when they recognize what they've done, there is this light that comes on in their eyes that it's like we've empowered them or they've got this superpower all of a sudden, and they're excited and they want to keep going. But we can also see that light dim when they're not provided content and instruction and validation for what they're doing. And I think that is so much more true, particularly for marginalized and neurodiverse learners.
You can see it. You can see it in their body posture, right? You can look. I could probably walk into any classroom in the nation and we would probably be able to pick them out, the ones you were talking. These are the ones that, they were given a mushroom and they learned how to read. Then we could, but you can see the kid, their head is down, and especially in any ELA block, right? Their shoulder, or guess what? Oh, my stomach hurts. I've got to go to the nurse, or I need to go to the bathroom, or, now that's the one that's, distracting the other kids.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
They're in there. I used to call it, because my son's name is Reese. He's in Reese world, right? He's in and that was his way of shutting down. Like and he still does it sometimes, I'll be like, Reese, but he went into his own little world, right? And that's the way they escape, right? They escape that fear, that condemnation, that just that isolation, that loneliness. And that for me is like, we can break that. We can fix that. We just have to give our teachers, and I like to call them the practitioners. We got to give our practitioners and the engineers, like you said, the tools to do it.
Yeah. And I think understanding that neurodiverse learners have strengths, but you have to find them. I think I'll go back to my son when he was in I think 7th or 8th grade. It was actually that same 504. So it was in 7th grade when his ELA teacher asked why his writing, sort of what she was suggesting is that there was some cheating going on at home, because she said the writing that he did when he was at home was so much better than what he produced in class. And so I asked her how she taught the writing process, and she could not give me an answer because she didn't teach the writing process. But when he was at home and he would tell me what his assignment was, I was teaching him the process. So of course the work he produced at home, explicit systematic instruction. But had I just listened to her, and I think about our parents who don't know, our caregivers who don't have that background, that are doing the best that they can. I was able to determine that the problem was in the classroom, right? And nail down what it was. And I will say that Stefan, later on, so probably his junior year in high school, I saw this, typewritten or printed out story, like short story. And I started reading it. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, started reading it. And I thought maybe it was an exemplar text or something that his English teacher had given. And so I'm reading, it's like, wow, this character development is really good. I mean, I'm getting engrossed in this paper. And he came in and I said, so what's this for? And he said, just something I'm working on. And I said, well, what class? And he said, he was just writing this story. Yeah. And I asked him to show me some of his other work. The kid could write stories, short stories, but had he been left to the devices of a practitioner, a teacher like he had, that might never have developed. The kid is an artist. I still say kid. They'll always be kids. It doesn't matter if they're 40. right? He's an artist, and that's where his strength, his talent was. But without educators who can recognize, identify, and then leverage the unique strengths that our neurodiverse learners have, I think that continues to fuel that school to prison pipeline.
It does. And they stifle that creativity, right? You think about that when you, I always say color outside the lines. It's a beautiful thing to color outside the lines. We don't all have to fit in to this little box, right? And thinking about what our elementary classrooms look like, especially for our neurodiverse kids, like sitting still, right? Do you have modifications where maybe they want to sit on a yoga ball? Maybe they want to lay on the floor, like for me, it's like, as long as they can focus and they're engaged, that's what's important. But we lose them. And the example you use, what if you hadn't had a clue about education? Let's just say that you worked at the grocery store, right? Or you didn't work, or you could have been a doctor, right? Like a medical doctor, but not having that educational knowledge.
Does not know pedagogy. Yeah.
Correct. But you think about a marginalized community. What if the parents are illiterate themselves? What if they can't help at home? That's not, then they think it is their problem. They think it's at the home, and it just, getting them to come into the IEP meeting is often a challenge to begin with, because they don't feel welcome. Right. So like making sure they understand that they are their child's best advocate despite their educational level. That, is a big thing that needs to be focused on, but bringing that back to teaching the parents how to identify those creative pieces in their children. What can they do with them? What can they expose them to? That it is this, I don't want to say a superpower, because that's stretch, but it is a great characteristic to have. Like, they think differently. You think if they just Googled, neurodiverse learners, some of our most creative geniuses, even if they couldn't prove to be dyslexic, Albert Einstein, they say they think likely was dyslexic. So you think about that, of turning it around, of instead of it being, this is, yes, we have an IEP and we need special accommodations, but what can we do as a community and as educators to really, really inform that and guide that?
Yeah. Sally Shaywood's book, Overcoming Dyslexia, probably 2004-ish. I don't know if you read it, but the last sort of, I think it was chapter, might have been an appendix. She talked about all the sort of, not all, but a number of famous people who have dyslexia and could not read. Tom Cruise evidently has such severe dyslexia. Somebody had to feed him. He had to learn his lines from somebody reading them to him.
Yes.
And yet you would...
Stephen King.
Yeah. I think Charles Schwab was it Charles Schwab? There was, another one. If people know that, especially parents and caregivers of neurodiverse learners, and educators and teachers and school administrators and school leaders, if they know that and can provide that information to children who are neurodiverse, to say, look, these are famous people that are just like you. For those children to have those mirrors would make a tremendous difference in their world.
Yes. And we have done that quite frequently throughout Tumbleweed. We have, really exposing them in read alouds to, really, really, important people, whether it's in acting, whether it's in writing, whether it's in the math and science field, making sure that they understand that. One of our dear family friends, who is the CEO of a very large company in the United States, over the holidays, when we got together with them and I was talking to him about what we were doing in Tumbleweed, his head flipped around. This is someone I've known for about 20 plus years. He goes, I'm dyslexic, right? And I said, I did not know you were dyslexic. Had no idea. So thinking about that, like you just said, of telling these kids, you could be the CEO of a corporation. You could be an author. You could be a musician. You can be this, you can be that. We're also trying to highlight neurodiverse kids. We have one in our Telling the Bees book about a young girl in Maine, Elizabeth Downs, who's Maine's youngest beekeeper. and she has profound ADHD, and thinking about what she is being able to do. So it's those mirrors, right? When they get to the back of the book and they can see themselves, right? Oh my God, if Elizabeth can do this, well, maybe they can go start a chess club, or maybe they can start, whatever, a music organization, or whatever they might want to do, that a young entrepreneur, right? So really trying to do that too, that you don't have to wait till you, quote, grow up to do something great. You can do something great right now for your community, for yourself, for, your friends. And so again, those mirrors are so important.
Yeah. Yeah. You and I could talk for hours on end. I have one last question for you. It's connected to my sign off. I always sign off with a paraphrase from Dr. Angela Davis. She said, "I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept." So my question is, what is the one thing you cannot accept? One. And then what can listeners do to support change to that effect?
Mm-hmm. Well, that is why I built Tumbleweed. I cannot accept anymore our marginalized communities and our neurodiverse kids not having the joy in literacy. That for me is just something that I just cannot do anymore. So listeners, you can empower your educators in your community. You can empower organizations to make sure that our neurodiverse kids, as well as our neurotypical marginalized kids, have access. Talk about it. Talk about it. Talk about it. Talk about it. The more we talk about it, the more people are going to listen.
Yeah. Thank you. And then how can folks reach you or find Tumbleweed if they have more questions?
Yeah. So you can go to www.tumbleweedpublishing.com. My email is Christina@tumbleweedpublishing.com. Super easy. Looking for more people to join our Tumbleweed movement. So stop on by.
All right. And we'll make sure that all of that is down in the notes as well. Equity Warriors, my guest today has been Christina Rodriguez, founder of Tumbleweed Publishing. Again, her contact information will be down in the notes. And Christina, I love chatting with you. It's always interesting, enlightening, fuels my passion for literacy. Equity Warriors, in today's climate where we have book bans, where we have threats to inclusive education and attacks on freedom to read, all of that being on the rise, your advocacy is more critical than ever. Take some action. Vote in every single election that's going on in your neighborhood, in your area. And it's so important that you vote for your school board races. Get informed. Protect access to diverse and affirming books for every single child. Attend those meetings. Use your voice. Speak out in person and on social media. Stay informed. Stay involved. And never, ever, ever underestimate the power of your advocacy to create classrooms where every single child is honored and thrives. Remember that in times of educational crisis, silence is not an option. So don't forget to grab your copy of my latest book, The Culturally Competent Educator, and then join me again next week. In the meantime, don't worry about things you cannot change. Change the things you can no longer accept. And that's a wrap for today's episode of the 3E Podcast. Now, here's how you can make a real difference. First, smash that subscribe button. It's free. It's easy. Just do it. Second, share the show with anyone you know who cares about education. And third, consider becoming a supporter of the show. Together, we're not just talking about change, we're making it happen. Make a donation today to be part of that mission and change, and I'll catch you next time.